Hello, welcome to the first of the new The Rights of Women interviews. I am absolutely thrilled today to be here with Olivia Sudjic, author of the novel Sympathy. We're going to talk about the book. There is also a review, so if you've come straight to YouTube, if you go to my blog, The Rights of Women, there's a review of the book on there that you'll be able to read as well. So, Olivia's debut novel Sympathy is being raved about on both sides of the Atlantic. Exciting times. First thing to ask you then, Olivia, is where did the initial idea for the book come from?
It sounds almost like ridiculous where it originally came from, because it, in superficial ways, seems so different now. But it originally came because I heard about this sort of 17th century medicine/technology that was sort of totally bogus, called Sympathy powder, and that was supposed to be this kind of charlatan sort of attempt at saying everything is made of the same stuff. So if you apply it to that object that's going across an ocean, it will still be in touch with you via this sympathy powder. So it was this bizarre, they used it to try and work out things like longitude, to try and sort of perform all kinds of occult, strange rituals. But I was interested in it because it had this capacity to collapse sort of time and space and connect things. And trying to work on that at the beginning, I sort of increasingly was trying to shut out the modern world, not look at Facebook, disconnect my computer. It was a distraction, and the internet was like my enemy. And then I realized that was sort of, maybe I should keep my enemies closer, and so Sympathy powder became modern technology. Right. It, in lots of ways, does a very similar thing. Like, it promises connection.
Oh, that's interesting. So it started as a historical...
It started as a historical novel, and like I say, I was trying to block out modern life, and then more and more I felt like I was maybe being too self-conscious about trying to, make sure there was no trace of myself, make sure I was sort of completely divorced in a way from the story I was telling. And then increasingly I felt like it wasn't as authentic as it could be if I just shed that self-consciousness. So, for example, the first person female narrator, her blinkered, quite claustrophobic way of telling the story is so important. And obviously, it's sort of what the plot hinges on is sort of what she tells or doesn't tell, how she manipulates you. And I was so wary of using the first person female. And then after a while I was like, well, the whole problem is she can't get into someone else's head, so I can't have a narrator that can do all of that. Once I'd shed that self-consciousness, which I don't think a man would have in the same way, I think I realised that basically no matter what you write as a woman, someone's going to say it's autobiographical. So in the end I just did what felt more natural to the story, and that was when the book really got going.
Okay. So on that sort of idea about it being autobiographical, even though it's not, you've got the interconnected stories in it. So the first line of Mizuko's story, Kasuna, is, origin stories make us feel secure. Untangling them can undo us, which I think could also almost be the strapline for Sympathy.
Yeah, I definitely felt like Alice, who tells the story, and I guess it's left implicit that it's probably a blog or some kind of uploading to the internet for anyone public to see. She's still trying to mimic Mizuko when she's writing. So Mizuko is her hero. Mizuko writes fiction, confessional fiction that uses her life in it. That's what draws Alice in at the start, and then she uses this form of confession, which is supposed to be almost like an apology or a last attempt at connection on the surface, but actually it's just another way in which she's still trying to sort of imprint herself in Mizuko's life, and this time by using the very thing that Mizuko does, which is confessional writing. And I think actually that in the end, you sort of feel a bit like you say, it could be the strapline for Alice's own story, which is exactly what, in a way, we don't even really know what the real Mizuko is like, but Alice is intent on her fitting exactly her own life.
Yeah. So the novel focuses on 3 female relationships. Obviously there's Alice's infatuation with Mizuko, but there's also Alice's relationships with her adopted grandmother Sylvia and her adopted mother Susie. So I'm interested in what interests you about female relationships.
No one's ever asked me that before.
No.
And it is, you're right. Like, I think first of all, just even the number 3, like I felt like the number 3 kept cropping up in the book in various ways. And I wanted for a start those relationships to be, all of them are older than Alice. And obviously the gap between her and Mizuko is very small. It's only sort of 7-8 years. But actually what I wanted to show with each of those different generations of women is the expanding gulf that happens the faster technology moves. So between Alice and Mizuko, not that much time between their birthdays, but actually it's a huge gulf in experience in terms of what one woman knows her life to be, which has been half offline and then half online, whereas Alice is a digital native who's never experienced life offline. And then with the other 2 women, obviously it's a similar thing in terms of their experience being very separate because of the way that their life has been lived in a more analog world. But in terms of it then being women more specifically, I guess I felt like because it's the women in her life who Alice has still got the potential to be close to, because her father has disappeared, her birth father has also disappeared, but in a much more anonymous fashion. It's also there where I guess I wanted to explore the kind of complexity that's quite unique to female relationships. And when she talks about her relationship to Mizuko, which she doesn't know necessarily if she's gay, she's not really sure what her feelings amount to, whether it's sort of like hero worship or whether it's friendship or whether it's just a desire to possess someone completely, which I guess borders on the sexual. But what she talks about is how the similarity is what draws her rather than difference. So it's that thing where in other women you see yourself reflected back at you, and often you're drawn to exactly what you maybe dislike in yourself, or that complexity is sort of so much sharper. And also I guess that I like the idea that women, historically especially, are seen as their power is the soft power, the manipulators, etc., because they can't just charge through the world doing what they like, so they have to find ways to make other people do what they want them to do. And so that sort of, all of the women have been kind of in certain ways compromised by men, and so all of them I think have found ways of making their way through life almost in opposition to men, and so I think that draws them all together as well.
Interesting. And so there's a lot of complexity there, and I think the book is a complex book. There's a lot in it. So I've written down big ideas: origin stories, quantum physics, disappearance of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370. Did you deliberately set out to write such a complex piece of work?
Well, there is that thing where supposedly your first book is like all the books you might ever write because you're afraid you'll never get to do it again. I definitely felt at the time a bit like Alice has these kind of slightly manic episodes where she kind of feels like everything is connected. I do feel like that is sort of the state of lots of writers, is to be able to see these connections between things, and then once you put the book to bed or it's published, you kind of wake up from that dream and you're like, wait a second. And at the time that all made sense. I think what I was trying to do, it's hard because obviously this is fiction and it's dealing with quite a lot of subjects that are real, and I didn't want to do a pseudo-journalistic sociological study of the internet. I wanted it to be fictional, but at the same time I wanted it to be subtle, and so that meant to me using metaphor, figurative stuff, and to me the things like the missing plane, the particle physics, that's all in a way, different sides of the same coin in terms of searches, the kind of human use of technology to solve things, and there just being unsolvable things that we can't really penetrate. So the missing plane, technology can't find it. The Higgs boson, we finally do find it after building the biggest machine known to man, and then what it proves is exactly in the middle of two opposing theories. So I guess it was that, and again, untangling origin stories, this need for humans to have a sort of certain stable platform on which to build an identity, but the impossibility of that. So when the practicalities of writing that then and putting all that together, how did that work? Have you seen Homeland, where Carrie kind of...
Yes.
I had I chopped up a big kind of cork board, and I had maps and diagrams, and part of that was to keep it all clear in my mind. Another part of it is because when you start, if you've never written fiction before, which I hadn't, I'd never done a course or any of that stuff. I mean, I'd written short stories at school, but it seemed absurd to be able to create real living people from a Word document. So I needed these kind of physical objects and maps and charts to make myself feel like I was following real people about on New York's grid. I definitely also felt like a friend of mine gave me some good advice, which was, he works in TV, but he says, what's the story about? What's it really about? What's it really, really about? And I had that kind of on a post-it above me. So, whenever I felt like I was moving between, I guess there are, again, 3 layers. Like, one is the kind of superficial relationship between 2 women and how technology enables that. Underneath that, it's like our individual relationship with technology and tool making in general, and how the thing we've created has ended up shaping us, spying on us, surveying us, and how increasingly our bubble, the internet was supposed to make everything open, and actually it kind of narrows it down now that corporate governments, etc., kind of have us at the very center of it, this very personalized world in which we move but don't really understand how it all works. And then underneath that, the kind of almost the physics of it is, how does that all, where does that sit, these digital selves, these, online world, what are we really made of? Like, what is it that separates us from somebody else, or one place from another? And there was a time I felt like I could understand particle physics. That time has gone. Right. But yeah, it was sort of like a way of keeping those 3 levels in a kind of visual form all around me, so that when I felt like it was maybe getting too complex, I could sort of, But again, another thing to say is that I was intending to mimic that way the internet has of making all information available all at once, and how when you're trying to do one thing, a sofa that you didn't buy 3 years ago will pop up again, or like a pregnancy test advert, and you're like, how does the internet know all this stuff about me? So those sort of often clunky or weirdly appropriate things that kind of dive bomb into your life from the internet was sort of how that complexity was supposed to kind of, I guess, echo. I wrote quickly, sensing that the appropriate time for confessions was drawing to a close, after which one would be most unwelcome. I suppose I also wrote it anonymously, though that didn't signify anything but my intimacy with her at the time. If someone had sent me something like that, I'd have assumed it was from her. I felt myself swimming to the surface as I wrote, my legs kicking, my arms outstretched and grasping, as if very soon I might be up in the light. Once I'd finished, I felt exposed, as if the sea had drawn back from the shoreline like lips revealing gums. It would be impossible, I thought, after reading it over to myself, for a wave not to come rushing back in. It would be impossible for her not to come back to me with all the force of shifting earth, rearing ocean, a wall of water behind her. I admit that some parts of it were fairly provocative. They were intended to be. As I say, any response seemed better than silence. So that it couldn't be instantly forwarded to the others it implicated, to endow it with a sense of occasion, I decided to print it rather than emailing. She had said she only read things properly in print, could only really, truly understand something if she could hold it. Outside, I felt an invisible field all around me that I swam in, every step slower than the last, the air thickening until I felt like I was wading through ketchup. Crowds seemed to form and throng around me wherever I stood. I had grown accustomed to being nameless and faceless in the city, my anonymity, the impersonal nudge and natter of the crowd, but now every face I passed seemed to show some kind of recognition. First, the guys in the lobby seemed much friendlier than usual. Then my homeless friend on the bench was back and acknowledged me with a hopeful wave. Then people I didn't know, random people on the street looking at me as if they knew me, and I thought I heard 1 or 2 whispering my name. The city knew me. It could distinguish my cry from a million other cries the way people say mothers know the cry of their own child. I went to use a computer in a convenience store that no longer exists, but that seemed to be built entirely out of stacked newspapers and 6-packs of bottled water. I can see the interior of the store now, narrow and dusty, with baroque flourishes of vacuum-packed fruit. I was now excruciatingly thirsty, despite being enclosed by walls of water and still desperate to pee, so that I wondered if I was in fact hallucinating. I tried to be quick, but I had to find a system of moving the mouse, directing its capricious rollerball where I didn't want it to go in order to get where I did. The keyboard had an unpredictable delay between my typing and words appearing, so that first I typed wrong and then I deleted wrong, and then I got trapped in that circle over and over. After 10 minutes I considered aborting the enterprise, but then the screen froze and so I couldn't. Abandoning it then would have meant leaving my confession open for all to see. I doubt if anyone had used that computer in years. The screen was set into one of those busts, warm beige like ancient stone at sunset. The warmth increased with its resistance. I was clearly dragging it back into a battle it had been assured was over. When I thought I'd won, the printer closed ranks. It was then that I made the first public sound that I had made in days. "Fuck," I said, like a bark. I paid for the printing, a correct stamp, and a large brown envelope. Brown hands appeared over the counter with a receipt, which was faintly comical to me, but which I kept as proof that I had sent something. I like to collect evidence of my life, and I also like to leave it around for others to puzzle over. I began pulling at the hairs on my clothes and letting them fly around, so that if, for example, I was murdered after this, my DNA would be all over the city, and the case would remain a talked-about but unsolved mystery. I was so jumpy, so unaccustomed since my correspondence with Sylvia to using real mail, that I very nearly inserted the envelope into a waste disposal unit. But I did send it, or rather, I dropped it into the correct metal box to be sent. I wanted it, very literally, out of my hands, for someone else to bear the weight of it. I calculated she would receive it within 48 hours. I went home and waited for each of those hours to elapse. As much as I feared her reaction, I feared her continued silence more. Yes, some things resisted. Some things felt like countersigns. The keyboard had been chalky. The keys stuck. I didn't have the right change. But I don't think if I had waited for this episode to pass, I would have been able to avoid writing what I wrote. I don't think it would have passed unless I'd written and sent it. It was about 20 pages long in total, with various subheadings and footnotes. The part I regret is the assumption she'd actually gone back to the hotel. The perversions I imagined to be taking place, the depraved scenes that had come to me, composites of images I'd seen on her phone with faces and features reallocated. I had wanted to goad her into admitting it. When another 48 hours had dragged by and I still hadn't heard from her, I asked the guys in the lobby if they would mind calling my phone to check that it was working. It was an English phone, so I figured this was reasonable, and I started to acquire a more stable frame of mind. Maybe there hadn't been enough in my account to pay my phone bill. Maybe I had reached my roaming limit. The phone proceeded to vibrate in circles on the desk. At first, sending the confession by real mail had felt like a genius device. I would not have to sit by my phone and watch for the signs that indicated it had been sent and seen. Slim but solid paper would, I hoped, convey me better. Now I had to consider the very real frailties of the system. Ludicrous, in fact, to entrust something of such magnitude to a mailman, a perfect stranger. I looked up stories of nefarious New York mailmen. There was one who had willfully upturned the lives of ordinary people like myself by hoarding 40,000 pieces of undelivered mail. The city was crawling with thieves and malcontents, and yet how treacherous, I thought, after such neutrality, bordering on indifference, and occasional open hostility, when the whole city finally seemed alive and tremulous to my touch, a seething structure reaching out to meet me and accommodate my every move as if I had been expected and was welcome there, that she was the only thing in it that would not respond.
Right, so the book spans 3 continents, the idea of 3 again, moving between the cities of London, Tokyo and New York. So what made you choose such a broad geographical space?
One reason, I guess, is to do with wanting to mimic that sort of internet power to be able to slip into other time zones, other geographical locations at will, and to kind of bring that sort of, global feel into a very intimate sort of, juxtaposition.
Yeah.
Another, I guess, was that the cities I chose, England I know, but in London and Tokyo and New York, it felt very much like they are the kind of cities that really embody how we think of cities as being about connection, order and chaos, and kind of all these, I guess, loneliness as well. I felt like New York is one of those places that if you've read a kind of Olivia Lang book, then you kind of, as you know, it's one of those places which promises connection and proximity, but actually those two don't necessarily mean that you gain real intimacy. Also, New York being this kind of grid, this sort of overlaying structure, this sort of motherboard underneath which all these interactions happen, some by accident but mostly engineered by technology now. So the way that an app means that you are 3 seconds away from meeting someone who shares all your interests, who happens to be walking down the street, or all those kind of things that are now planned for. I saw almost technology as being like a form of urban social planning, which engineers all the interactions the characters have. So there was like a lot of reasons, and I guess lastly, New York being this place which we are all used to seeing via a screen in our kind of collective cultural psyche. It's this place of myth and sort of Friends and sitcoms, and being able to kind of meet someone that you've only seen via a screen is what happens to Alice when she meets Mizuko. And then it's the same when she arrives in New York. It's like she's going through the screen and into the world of film, photography, Edward Hopper painting. And I think that was sort of, again, that's where the sort of Alice through the looking glass thing happens. You go in through this mirror, this screen, and into another world that's sort of like what you know but different.
So let's talk about Alice a little bit, because she's a really complex character.
Yeah.
Her behaviour towards Mizuku makes her somewhat unlikable.
Yes, definitely unlikable. Definitely.
She redeems herself somewhat caring for Sylvia when she's ill. Now, I'm sure you've come across this idea that there's a big issue in publishing with readers, not sure where it's coming from really, about unlikable female characters.
Yes.
Did you consider it when you were writing it?
Yes. And also the book is called Sympathy, so every time someone says, you can't feel sympathy for Alice, I'm like, definitely I considered it. I happen to be the type of person or the type of reader or watcher who really likes unlikable female characters, because I feel so much like they, they're just being honest often, and I don't mean as in truthful, I just mean a kind of unvarnished version of themselves. And I also, I guess I felt like there's already the play between Alice and Mizuko and writing fiction and writing from your life and all that kind of stuff, which nods to the fact that women have to airbrush themselves into sort of stories often. I guess I feel like she does kind of redeem herself, and then she loses Sylvia as well. So I feel like after a while I felt like the kind of person who still has sympathy for her, not likes her but has sympathy for her, is someone who can see often what's invisible to even to Alice herself, the way in which she's been rejected at points, the way that she is manipulated or used or suffers actually quite a lot in ways that she doesn't often register herself. So it was, I actually, I guess I feel like I wanted her not to have to be likable in order to be sympathetic. But also, I guess she is complex, but that is also partly because she's not a very 20th or even 19th century character, more 19th even. She's much more 21st century in the way that she's very porous, and she doesn't have like a strong, stable identity. So other people's characters kind of move in and out of her all the time. So she's not really one person, and she doesn't really say, hello, I am this age with this colour hair. She doesn't have a very definite shape. So she also just sort of morphs along as the story goes.
It's interesting you describe her like that, because one of the other things that I found fascinating is that she's a young mixed race woman, but it's barely mentioned in the book.
Well, I guess, you've got a question, but I guess I sort of felt like there was lots of things going on there. One, I didn't want her to have to state that at the beginning, as though, it's something that she actually does mention. She talks about, for example, having fairy knots in her hair, and there are little hints, I guess, but she doesn't state it explicitly. That's something that the novel still has over forms of social media or the internet, is you don't have to know what someone looks like at the very beginning in order to be drawn into their story. I guess, she also doesn't necessarily identify as somebody who is biracial. She sort of feels very much like she's been transplanted again and again and again into different families, and that's ongoing throughout the novel. That more than anything else, what defines her is not knowing, you know, who she is or where her tribe is or what family she has. And I think that's, you know, an example of where she starts to, by moving back to New York, I guess, feel like she is part of a, you know, racial, oppressive system, and she starts to have these minor, you know, microaggression type interactions with people that do start to make her feel like, actually, I might identify in this way or that way, but it kind of comes from her rather than a label. So I felt like for her to start off at the beginning by stating these sort of, you know, biographical or, you know, details, and you know, when you do find out most explicitly, it's when she's filling in a form which has boxes about ethnicity to tick. So in a way, that was like a joke about that. Exactly.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting in terms of the debate around representation in publishing that we'd chosen to do it.
Well, so that the thing there was that I felt like, obviously, you know, you might be a Jonathan Franzen who says you cannot write anybody that you haven't loved, which I find interesting. You know, there is obviously a stay in your lane kind of thing, which is definitely true. And you don't, you know, being an ally doesn't mean grabbing the mic, but at the same time, I don't feel like I have written a book that's about a racial experience. It's very much about, you know, identity, and I also felt like it felt relevant to the story in so many ways to have her not be one race, and to be biracial and to be confused about that, but that is at the limit of my experience. So I didn't want to go, I feel like as a writer, obviously, when you write male characters, when you write whatever, you are acknowledging that you are testing the limits. But in a way, I felt like a good thing to do was to shine a light on where those experiences between different identities sort of are. Yeah. And so writing into the border of my experience was sort of it was like the challenge I set myself, basically.
So you just mentioned Jonathan Franzen, which is interesting because you've got the one-word cover. Yeah. Sorry, the one-word cover, the one-word title. Yeah. The really striking cover.
Love the cover.
Yes.
Not me, but...
Dare I say it, it's quite bold for a woman writer.
I definitely felt like I had always had the title as Sympathy in my mind. I kind of couldn't believe it hadn't already been taken. It is part of the title of the first American novel, but not since then, or, you know, The Sympathizer, but not that one word. And I did feel like hesitant or cautious to touch it for that reason. I mean, then I had a bit of a sort of pep talk where I was like, no, Jane Austen, persuasion. Yeah. And I do feel like it was sort of something that, again, like with the talking myself out of feeling too self-conscious to use the first person or a female narrator roughly my age, it felt like another way of saying, you know, Alice can be as self-important as she likes. Yeah. You know?
Love it. So you were chosen, one to you now, you were chosen as one of the Observer's New Faces fiction for 2017. How did that feel?
It's weird. Obviously it's good, but it is weird. Like, I never thought, you know, when I wrote, in a way, you're writing like no one's ever going to read it, and you spend quite a long time in sort of seclusion. It is funny, especially given some of the themes of the book. It is quite an out-of-body experience when you see like your name or like your surname in print, just like without the Olivia part, just like my surname. I feel like, who is that? Obviously it was good, but I feel at the moment a bit like I'm desperate to write another one, because at the moment I'm just synonymous with this one other book, right. And I guess that partly means that you feel like there's more that I want to try and do that's different, and so on and so forth, but also because then it takes the pressure off, and you spread yourself out a bit, and then everyone's like, what about the difficult second album? So basically it's all a bit, you know, it's all a bit stressful and a bit like overwhelming, but you know, it's better than obviously not getting published, like, I guess.
So, last thing, my blog's specifically about women writers, so I'm interested if there's anything by women that you've read recently that you would recommend.
Oh yeah. God, where to start? I mean, so there are things, you know, obviously that I read recently that I haven't sort of, you know, almost finished processing. I always recommend Maggie Nelson. Yeah. I always recommend Lydia Davis, because when I feel like I've sort of, you know, maybe read a few books that kind of throw me off what I feel like is sort of at the core of why I love reading or writing, I go back to them and I'm like, oh yes. The last thing I read that was by someone who was a woman who I hadn't read before was Ellie Goldstone's Strange Heart Beating.
Oh yeah.
And that was wonderful, really kind of, well, in some ways the opposite to what mine was about, but similar themes of kind of obsessive love, or, you know, trying to drag information out of somebody, and that obviously meaning that instead of getting to know them, you feel more and more estranged from them. So yeah, that was an interesting counterpoint to read, given the same sort of similar themes.
I'm pleased that's good, because it's on my pile.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
It's good.
Right, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today.
Lovely.
Thank you so much. If you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link below to my review of Sympathy, which is on my blog. There are also links to buy the book if you're interested, which I'm hoping you are, because it's fantastic.